Paul.
Thanks, Steve. I can't follow that, but I'll try.
Wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's great. It's great. Good morning, church. Good to see everyone this morning. We are glad that you're here. Glad that you're feeling better. Glad that you're able to be out with us this morning. It's good to see you. We have several visitors with us this morning. We are very thankful and very appreciative that you're here with us, and hope that you'll come back any and every opportunity that you have to be a part of our service at River Road. There was a man one time that went to his doctor. You've probably heard the story, as a matter of fact. He went to his doctor, and he told the doctor what problems he had, and so the doctor said fine. And so a few days later, the doctor called and he said, "Sir," he said, "I have some bad news and I have some worse news." And the man said, "Oh my." He said, "Well, what's the bad news?" And the doctor said, "Well, the bad news is you only have 24 hours to live." And the man said, "Oh my, well, what could be worse?" And he said, "Well, I was supposed to call you yesterday." Now, that's an old story, but it bears repeating because it helps lead us to where I want us to go this morning. We all have but little time. And that's just a fact, that you and I have just a very little time here upon the face of the earth. And while the Bible will talk about man's life is like a vapor, James reminds us in James 4. And the psalmist would remind us that our days are few, that if by reason of strength we'll have 70, maybe 80 years. By reason of strength, though, he says, then we're soon cut off and we fly away. And yet, while we have that time, we know that it's precious. We know that time of spending time with others in relationships, building others up, encouraging others, helping others, that time we spend with those precious loved ones is just that. It is precious. Jesus, in John the 7th chapter, is talking to, if you will, a group of people. The best we can fix time-wise, it is October of right before the spring in which Jesus will be crucified. And so some 6 months before he will die, Jesus makes this statement in John 7, verse 33, "Yet a little while am I with you." I don't know about you, but when I read that gives me reason to pause and think. Not just because Jesus said it, and not just because of the fact that he realized that his end was coming quickly, but it's the same with all of us, isn't it? We know not the day or the hour, but we do know that we have a little while. And as we'll conclude the sermon, we have to understand that it's important that we're careful with what we do with that little while. But what I want to ask and what I want to think this morning is about what Jesus did with that little while. What are some of the things that Jesus did? Because admittedly, if you stop to think, if the doctor comes in and forbid this to ever happen to anyone, but we know that it does. But if the doctor came in and said you have 6 months or 6 years to live, and you made out a list of what you would do, what are some of the things you'd put on it? Oh, well, I'd make this journey, or I'd go here, or I'd do that, or I'd spend time here, or I'd say this, or I'd do that. Well, let's think about what Jesus did. The first thing we want to note is the fact that Jesus went about doing his Father's business. Well, that was important, wasn't it? Doing his Father's will. Jesus always considered that, yea, even from the time he was but a child. In John the 12th chapter, John the 2nd chapter, I must be about my Father's business. He understood that. And then while he said in John the 9th chapter, verse 4, that I must work the works of him who sent me while it is yet day, for night comes and no man works. Even within the last hours of his life in John the 17th chapter, as he's praying his prayer to God, he says in verse 4, I've finished the work that you've given to me to do. You see, he understood that God's will and God's business was important. He understood that it was important that that little while that he spent upon the face of this earth, that he did God's business. And though he were a son, the Hebrew writer reminds us in Hebrews 5, yet learned he obedience by the things that he suffered. He learned obedience. He understood it. He came to understand obedience by the things that he went through. He understood God's will was first and was paramount in his life. Now we have to ask ourselves, do we spend our few minutes, our little while, do we spend our little while doing God's will? It's important that we do God's will. It's vital that we do God's will. When we stop and think about and we ask ourselves, what is my aim in life? Well, my aim in life is heaven. That's where I'm shooting for. I want to, in the end, hear the words, well done, good and faithful servant. And while that's my aim, my goal must be to praise and glorify God. Psalmist reminds us in Psalm 86 and verse 12. He says, I will praise your name. I will seek you with my whole heart. And so we're to give God, according to 1 Chronicles 16, verse 23 through verse 25, we're to give God the glory that is due his name. That's my purpose in life. My aim is heaven. My purpose is to glorify God. And so whatever I do in word or deed, I'm supposed to do all in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm to do God's will. You see, my few minutes, my little while, we often sit and think, well, my little while is for me. My little while is about me. My little while is to be centered upon me. And yet, Jesus was not concerned with himself. When you read that passage that we probably can all quote in Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 5, where he talks about, let this mind be in you, which is also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, did not think it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, was made in the likeness of man. You thought about that? Have you thought about the fact that Paul says, here's what he gave up, but here's what he became, and he did that because he understood that to be the Father's will. What did he do with that little while? He made sure that his life was a life that was a beacon for the Lord. And so you see, with my aim and my purpose, my goal then is to let my light so shine before men, that they may see my good works and glorify my Father, which is in heaven. And so I live my life. I live my little while thinking about what can I do so that God will be glorified? What can I do to bring glory? What can I do to bring honor to my God, my Father, just as Jesus did? But then secondly, Jesus spent his little while going about and helping others. Jesus was not concerned with self. When you go back to that Philippians 2 passage and you think about that, you think about the fact that Jesus was not concerned with himself because he left the very best place that could be imagined, heaven itself, to come to this old world so that he could serve mankind. See, in Acts the 10th chapter, Peter, in talking about the life of Christ, capsulized it just that way. In verse 38, he says that he went about, talking about Jesus, he went about doing good. That was Jesus' life. But that was his aim in life, wasn't it? In Matthew the 20th chapter, didn't Jesus say that he said, I came not to be served, but to serve. I came not so that people would lavish things upon me. I came not so that people would bring me things. But I came to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. Jesus was all about others. We see that. We see it in Matthew 8 when the centurion came and asked Jesus that he might heal his servant who was sick, dying at home. We see it when Jesus comes upon a widow of Nain, and he realizes that the one in the casket is her son, her only son, and he raises her child from the dead. We see that when Jesus is walking around and he's been preaching, and he comes to what is the end of the day, and he realizes that these people have been with him all day and they're hungry. And so what does he do? He calls upon them to gather together what is had, and one little boy pulls out 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and Jesus feeds 5,000 folks. Why? Because they were hungry. We look at the life of Jesus and we see countless stories of what Jesus did for others. Not for himself, but for others. Yea, his very life was consumed in that very idea. And when he talked about going to Jerusalem to die, when he talked about going to Jerusalem, his apostles wanted to talk him out of it. If we go back there, they're going to die. If we go back there, they're going to kill you. If we go back there, it's a bad idea. They don't care anything but to take your life. And Jesus said, I've got to go. And so guess what they said? Well, let's go with him, that we may die with him. In other words, they resigned themselves to the ministry that Jesus had with regards to his life, that of helping others. Jesus professed it. Jesus practiced it. You see, he'd talk about helping others, wouldn't he? He'd talk about going the second mile. He'd talk about being the Good Samaritan. But then in practice, he practiced what he preached. But what about us? What's the charge? What has God given to us? What has God told us? Well, in Romans chapter 15, Paul would say in verses 1 really through 3, but Paul would say that we're not to look upon our own things, but others. Let no man do what? Let every man serve his neighbor. That's an interesting concept. Because in the idea of service, we understand that service means that sometimes I am less of self and more for others. And yet that's what Paul was teaching. You see, we need to look upon others as being individuals that we can serve and must serve. That we love them enough that by love we're to serve one another. That's what Paul wrote to the churches of Galatia, Galatians chapter 5, verse 13. Here's the admonition. You need to love one another in that you need to find out what your brother and sister needs, what your fellow man needs, and see what you can do to help. Now, sometimes you can't help. That's true. But if there's something you can do, you need to do it. If there's some way you can help, you need to help. For as we have opportunity, Paul wrote to the churches of Galatia, as we have opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially those of the household of faith, but let's do good to all. Jesus spent his few minutes, Jesus spent his little time helping others. And it's important that we learn the idea of helping and helping others. There was a lady one time that was going out to take care of some family business. And as she did, she sadly ran over something, and her tire went flat on her car. She pulled off to the side of the road. She was unable, because of some physical issues, she was unable to change the tire in her car, and she watched as cars drove by. Some with a bumper sticker, honk if you love Jesus, God's my co-pilot, and such like. None stopped. Finally, she hears a vehicle coming, literally hears it coming. And she looks in her rearview mirror and she sees an old, beat up, dilapidated truck. And she thinks, oh my, he's not going to help. And he pulls in behind her. And he walks up to her car. Ma'am, can I help you? She says, well, I've got a flat tire and I need it fixed. She noticed that he was dressed not in the best of things, and so she was kind of suspicious of what was going on, what was about to happen. And he said, well, if you'll release the trunk, I'll get the spare out, and I've got some things, some jacks and all in my truck, and I'll get you fixed. And so in just a few minutes, he fixed her flat tire. He came back up to the window. He knocked. He said, ma'am, he said, it's taken care of. You can go on your way. She said, well, how much do I owe you? He said, I don't want a dime. I don't want a dime. I was just glad to help. You see, we need to ask ourselves that very question. Am I spending my life, my little while, helping others? Am I doing what I can for others? Jesus did. And if Jesus did, so should I. But Jesus spent his little while not only helping others, but forgiving others. I found this to be probably one of the hardest things that God has asked us to do. You know, it's easy to get up on Sunday morning, get ready, and go to church. It really is. It's easy, at least for me, not to use profanity. It's easy for me to tell the truth. Now, there are other things. That's not to say, oh, preacher, you're the pinnacle. No. I'm not going to tell you what it's hard for me to do. But one of the things that it is most difficult is to forgive others. Think about Jesus for just a few minutes before we get to ourselves. The woman in adultery in John the 8th chapter. She's caught in adultery. Now let's say this. These are charges that shouldn't have been brought. Why? Because according to the old law under which they were under, there had to be 2 eyewitnesses brought. They were brought to Jesus to trap Jesus. That's what it was all. That was what the whole story was all about. But when no one would ultimately condemn her, as we condense the story, Jesus said, I don't condemn you either. Go your way and sin no more. He doesn't tell her what she's doing is all right. He just says, you quit doing what you're doing. But he forgives her. There's another instance in the Bible in which Jesus forgave. It's interesting because in Luke chapter 22, Jesus is telling Peter that he's going to go away. Now, you might say, go away from where? Go away from his presence? No. He says, Peter, Satan has desired you that he may sift you as wheat. But I've prayed for you, that your faith fail not. And when you returned, now can you imagine, first of all, the privilege of being with the Lord? But you're there in conversation with the Lord, and the Lord looks at you and says, when you come back, after you've gone away, after you've listened to and you've given heed to the call of Satan, when you come back, strengthen the brethren. In other words, Peter, I've forgiven you. I've forgiven you already. And then as you continue reading the book of Luke, Jesus is hanging on the cross. And there below him are the folks that are laughing, spitting, making jokes, making fun, wagging their heads as he's dying on a cross for them and for all of mankind. And he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That was how Jesus spent his few minutes. That's how Jesus spent his little while. Forgiving those that had done something against him. Now let's think. Is that how we spend our life? Do we spend our life forgiving those that have done things against us? And folks, you don't have to go very far, look very hard till you find in your life someone that you've forgiven or that has done something against you, and hopefully you have forgiven. I pray often that God will give me a forgiving heart. Why? Because Paul would write in Romans chapter 12 and verse 17, as much as lies in you, live peaceably with all men. Jesus would preach the Sermon on the Mount that you're to forgive your brother. That if your brother trespasses against you, to talk to him. Matthew 18. But ultimately what you are to do and what we are to do is to forgive them for what they've done. Paul would write to the church at Colossae, and he would say, and I think it's interesting, that he would put the two ideas together: forbearing one another, or being patient, the New King James Version says, one with another, forgiving one another. Isn't that interesting? It talks about being patient with people and then forgiving them, all in the same little line there. You be patient with folks, but you forgive them of what they've done. See, sometimes it's easier to hold a grudge than it is to actually forgive them. A story that would take you back to the old days. This was before mechanization. This was before the farmers had tractors. There was an old farmer out plowing in the field, and his mule was not cooperating, pulling the plow the way he should. And the preacher noticed it. He had gone to visit the man, and so he walked up to the old farmer and he said, he said, I just believe if you'd tell that mule G and use haul that mule would go in the direction that you wanted him to go. And the old farmer looked at the preacher and he said, I won't do it, I won't do it. And the preacher said, why? And he said, because that mule kicked me 15 years ago and I hadn't forgiven him, and I'm not talking to him because I hadn't forgiven him. Now, we live life like that, don't we? And yet, we need to let our grudges go. Jesus did. Jesus would. If Jesus is willing to forgive those that crucified him, surely those that have said something against us or said something to us or those that have done something to us, they're not worthy of us holding a grudge. But they are deserving of the forgiveness that our Lord would give. And so, when Jesus was asked, Lord, if my brother sins against me, how many times am I to forgive him? 7 times? And Jesus said, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. In other words, you keep forgiving. As they keep messing up, you keep forgiving. Jesus forgave others. Do we spend our little while forgiving others? Jesus prayed. Jesus got alone with God. That's how he spent his little while. You can't hardly turn a page in the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Somewhere at that opening, and if it's not there, it'll be the next opening, where Jesus did not, or where it says something about Jesus praying. Almost every opening, or within a page or two of that opening, Jesus prayed. Whether it was the choosing of the 12 apostles, or it was right before he died. Jesus prayed. Jesus believed in the power of prayer. He believed that God would hear and God would listen and God would take hold of. This past Sunday night, you can go back and look at our website or listen to the sermon we talked about pray when times are tough. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16. Jesus, though, he prayed often and he taught often on prayer. If you look just in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, you're going to find not one reference, not 2, but 3 references of Jesus talking about prayer in that short little sermon. And there's seemingly even other kind of little sidelights that might even lend itself to the idea of prayer. Well, then we ask ourselves, do we spend our little while alone with God? Do we spend time drawing near to God, as James reminds us in James 5, draw near to God and he'll draw near to you? Do we let our heart's requests be made known to God? Do we tell him what's going on in our life and in our heart and in our thinking? Do we spend time praying? Do we spend time on our knees? Maybe not literally, but figuratively, with our heads bowed and our hearts humbled, talking to God, communing with Him, letting Him know, letting Him feel, letting Him understand, letting Him see. You see, prayer will change things in your life. If you don't believe it, go back 1 Samuel, the first chapter, and read about the story of Hannah. You don't believe it, go back and read in the book of 1 Kings or 2 Kings, read about a man by the name of Hezekiah that was granted life for 15 more years because of prayer. Or how about Elijah and the rain, the not raining, and all of that went on with Elijah? Power of prayer. Spend time talking to God. Jesus did. But then Jesus spent his little while with people. I like that aspect. Jesus was not an ascetic. Jesus didn't go off into his own corner of the world and hide. Now, I realize that some folks are more sociable than others. Some folks like quietness and like being by themselves. I get that, and that's fine. There are times when I feel that way. I had once, back about 5, no. But there are folks that like that, and that's fine. But we also have to understand that Jesus went to the people. The difference, or one of the differences, not the difference, but one of the differences between the ministry of John and the ministry of Jesus was that John was out in the wilderness and people came to him. Jesus went to the marketplaces. Jesus went to where the people were sitting. Think about it. We don't get very far. You study the life of Christ, you don't get very far till Jesus is in the synagogue. Why the synagogue? Because that's where the people were. And they were worshiping. Why is he there? Because that's where the people were. Or how about John chapter 2? Early, first thing, Jesus' ministry. Where is he? He's at a marriage feast, Cana of Galilee. Now, I know most of us guys say, I don't want to go to a wedding. I get you. The aspect of Jesus going to where people were. He was a social person. Did he draw himself away at times? Yes. Did he get up early in the morning in order to go pray to God? Yes. Did he get off a little while in order to rest? Yes. Did he sleep? Yes. He was in the bottom of the boat. Remember when the storm was raging? Oh, yes. Jesus spent his time with people. So what does that teach us? Well, it teaches us that we're to love one another. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples if you have love one for another. Jesus reminds us in John 16. That we are to be creatures, individuals that love one another, that love one another with a pure heart, that we love one another because we're concerned about them. You see, it gets back to the social aspect, doesn't it? Jesus went about doing good. And how did he do that? By being with people. The church cannot remove itself from people and say, we built a building, that's sufficient. That can't happen. This week we added 2 tracks. We're trying to refurbish our track rack and doing our own tracks. And the first 2, you might recall, that we put out there was one on pain and one was on discouragement. We put 2 more out there this week, one on anger and one on worry. If you've got that problem or you know a friend's got that problem, pick up that little track. It's very short. Share it with them. That's what Jesus did among people. That's what we're to do among people. How do you spend your little while? How do you spend your little time? Story is told of a little community called Texline, Texas. It's in the Panhandle, right there up close to the Mexico border. It's a little community. It flourished for a while when the railroad went through back many years ago. But then soon the fervor died, and it went to a community of 400 for a long time. I looked last night. It's actually, according to the census of 2010, they've gotten 100 more people. It's now 500 people. There's a writing in one of these travel brochures about Texline, Texas. Here's what it said. At one end of town, there's a city limit sign. At the other end of town, there's a city limit sign. There's not much in between the two city limit signs. When we die, if we die before the Lord comes back, they'll bury us. They'll put us in the ground, and someone in our family that loves us enough will put a marker over our grave. And it'll have the date that we were born, and it'll have the date that we died. And in between those two dates will be a little dash. That's your little while. What'd you do with your dash? What'd you do with your little while? Hopefully you did exactly what Jesus did. This morning, if you're not a New Testament child of God, or if you're an individual that, as a child of God, needs to ask for the prayers of the church, our prayer is that you'll come. All together we stand and sing.